Welcome to the first class of this particular iteration of Meditation 101. We do this class a few different times a year, generally on this time slot, Tuesdays from 7 to 8:30. It will be a 3-week course this time. Sometimes we do it as a 4-week course. When we do finish at the end of the month, then in January, we will replace this class in this time slot with Introduction to Mindfulness with Venerable Katie. That will be actually a 5-week course, so that will continue to meet in this time slot. So these are both introductory level courses that FPMT, the international organization that our center is an affiliate of, have created for complete beginners to Buddhist meditation. So you're welcome to, you don't have to take both, but if you were interested in learning more specifically about introspective awareness and mindfulness meditation, then you could continue on and take that course as well. This is a broader kind of overview of Tibetan Buddhist meditation. And I say Tibetan Buddhist because our center, Thupten Norbu Ling, is a Tibetan Buddhist center. And so the material that we will be presenting in this course, and broadly speaking, the material that we present in all of the courses that we offer, does come from that tradition. So you find different packagings of Buddhism in different traditions around the world, Zen Buddhism, Theravadan Buddhism, what have you. So we are from this one particular lineage, and that is going to inform how we present things, particularly when we talk about what's called analytical meditation, which is something that we'll cover. So, as I said, it's a 3-week course, and it's kind of a survey of Buddhist meditation, Tibetan Buddhist meditation. We're going to talk about things like, what is the purpose of meditation? How do you define it? What are the skills that are involved, that a person cultivates and relies on in meditation? What are the obstacles to meditation, and how do we apply antidotes to those obstacles that arise when we try to meditate, and also how to set up a meditation practice at home. And then, as I said, different kinds of or types of meditation. So really the way that I would describe or define this course is, its aim is to tell people or give people the information that they would need to be able to set up their own practice at home. We will be doing some meditation together in these 3 classes, but I wouldn't say that the main purpose is the practice of meditation. The main purpose of the course is not really the group practice of meditation. It's to give you this broad level overview of, the philosophical side of Tibetan Buddhist meditation, so that you feel confident in beginning your own practice at home, if that was something that you were interested in, to give you some skills, to give you some basic knowledge, to get you started in your own practice at home. So I know that that's a very introductory level overview of the course. Did that spark any process questions or anything that anyone would like to ask at this point? Feel free to just unmute and ask if you've got a question. Okay, so we'll begin then just by talking about what is meditation. What you find as English. I'm in English. English is the only language that I speak, and not that well. I certainly don't speak Tibetan, and I can't read Sanskrit. So I'm in the same boat as everyone else, in the sense that everything that I've learned had to be translated into English, and there are limitations and nuance when that happens, because these teachings were originally written down in, as I said, Sanskrit, maybe Pali in some cases, and then they had to be translated into Tibetan, and then someone had to translate them again into English. So when we say meditation, um, the word that we're translating from the Tibetan is the word Gom, Gom, Gom. If you come to the center, or you go to another Tibetan Buddhist center, they will refer to the place of meditation as the Gompa, the place of meditation. And so the word Gom means to become familiar, to familiarize the mind. And that is really the ultimate goal of a meditation practice. It is to set aside time, ideally every single day. We probably aren't going to start with every single day, but ideally, after a few months, after a year of cultivating the habit of meditating, we ideally would like to get to the point where it's every single day, at least once or maybe twice a day, where we set aside 20, 30, 45 minutes, maybe eventually, where we are concentrating the mind on what we would call a virtuous object. Because when we say familiarizing the mind, then the question becomes familiarizing the mind with what? And so, from the Buddhist perspective, what they would say is that naturally we spend a lot of our time familiarizing our mind with things that are not so virtuous, that are not so beneficial, not so useful. Um, so we don't need to be doing more of that. In our spiritual practice, we need to carve out time where we focus our attention on constructive, virtuous objects, things like loving kindness, compassion, generosity, patience, ethical restraint. These are constructive states of mind that we can intentionally cultivate, that we can, by setting aside this time over years, we can change our baseline state. And that's really the fundamental purpose of Buddhism, generally, is that what Buddhism would say is that we come into our spiritual practice with a certain set of habits, tendencies, familiarities. And some of them are constructive. We certainly have uh, a degree of familiarity with all of these constructive mental states. But we are also familiar with, sometimes being impatient, sometimes being unkind, sometimes having thoughts of ill will toward others, sometimes, engaging in actions that are harmful to those around us. Sometimes we're deceptive. Sometimes we get angry and we act, unskillfully when anger strongly arises in the mind. And so, by setting aside this time to cultivate these really constructive states of mind, really what we're doing is we're crowding out, because in a day, we're going to be conscious for a certain number of hours, and we're going to be creating familiarities and habits over the course of that day by engaging in our actions of body, of speech, of mind. And the more moments in a day that we can have where the mind is directed toward a constructive object, then necessarily in those moments, the mind isn't having angry thoughts or jealous thoughts or, destructive actions. We're not acting in ways that are harming those around us, and we're not creating the inner mental conditions that set the stage for the actions that harm others. In fact, we are actively cultivating the opposite. When a person is absorbed in loving kindness, compassion, generosity, patience, ethical restraint, and so on, the actions that flow from that state of mind necessarily are beneficial to those around us. People who are absorbed in loving kindness don't steal from other people. They don't, hit other people out of anger. They don't, react in violent, painful ways. They instead act in ways that are very pro-social, very beneficial for others. And then, of course, we'll touch a little bit. This course is really for people who are complete beginners, who have not necessarily any um, experience with meditation. We'll touch a little bit on the ways that meditation in a specifically Buddhist context does support um, deeper, more transformative states of mind. But this is your meditation practice, right? So there is no need to become Buddhist to have a meditation practice. You can integrate a meditation practice with any other kind of generally constructive philosophical system. But it is true that from the Buddhist perspective, the Buddha did teach meditation to serve a deeper purpose as well, which is something that we can also use it for if we choose. And we won't go into that in great detail, but we'll touch on that a little bit. And then we've got many, many other courses that we offer where we do that are listed kind of in the intermediate level, the advanced level, where we are focusing much more on those specifically Buddhist applications of meditation. So it is, though, important to recognize that this idea of familiarizing the mind with a virtuous object does mean that meditation is already, even at that level, serving a fairly significant purpose. It is not, some people associate meditation with relaxation, with kind of tuning out. And a lot of times in our culture, people will talk about the health benefits of meditation and so on. And those are all true. It is restorative, it is relaxing, it is refreshing. It does lead to a spaciousness in the mind that is useful in a general sense. But this idea of cultivating these constructive states of mind is something that necessarily at least goes a little bit deeper than that. It is meant to really change our, as I said, sort of our baseline familiarities, our baseline habits. And as I said, that's the premise of Buddhism, is that we maybe we start out as someone who has a short temper, or we start out as someone who is very attached to material objects and so on. But then in 5 years, in 10 years, we can become different. We can, through intentionally directing the mind in this constructive direction, we change and we develop new habits, new familiarities, new tendencies, new ways of thinking and acting that are in line with this constructive, virtuous direction. So we're not born with the maximum amount of patience or loving kindness or compassion or generosity that it's possible for us to cultivate. We can, over time, by directing our mind on these virtuous objects, by carving out this time and going back to these virtuous objects again and again, we can evolve into a person who has as their baseline state a higher degree of patience and loving kindness and compassion and generosity and so forth. And that's really the fundamental premise of why meditation is taught from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective, is to move in a spiritual direction over time. And meditation really is the inner technology that the Buddha taught for how to engage in that process, how to actually move from someone who might be struggling with a temper or what have you, and then gradually work with those habits, work with those tendencies. So it's certainly not, Buddhism would acknowledge that it is relaxing and so on, but really those are just side effects that are not the purpose of meditation. They're not why meditation is taught as a inner technology. It's really taught as the vehicle for change, that or inner transformation of the mind. Okay. Does that all make sense? Are there any questions? All right. Yes. Let's see. Does Miriam have a question or just?
No, no question at all. I just wanted to let you know that it was understandable. Thank you.
All right. So the first thing that we're going to discuss is when we say meditation, we are talking about formal meditation that's done generally at home. Of course, you may do it at a Buddhist center or, but if you're going to have a daily practice, it's going to be done at home. And there is a posture that goes along with the act of engaging in a session of meditation. We'll talk about how to set up a session of meditation, different objects of meditation, and so on. But we're going to begin with the physical body, what we do with our physical body in meditation. So, generally, ideally, the theory is that a person would be using a cushion on the floor. That may or may not be practical for all people. It's certainly not practical for all people. Some people do use a chair, and that's perfectly valid. But we will first look at this sort of ideal physical posture that is presented. And the purpose of thinking about our physical posture, regardless of whether it is a chair, whether it's a cushion on the floor, the purpose of it is to set the body in a stable position, to find some kind of stable position, because as a person, we can talk about meditation as both a process and also as a skill. When we talk about it as a skill, then we've said that the universe of objects that we are directing the mind toward are virtuous objects, right? We're not intentionally trying to cultivate non-virtue. We're not trying to use meditation to become angrier people, but when we talk about it as a skill, then what we are talking about is cultivating calm, focused attention toward this virtuous object. And that is a process. We can grow not only in our habituation, our familiarization with these virtuous objects like loving kindness, but we can become better at generating calm, focused attention that we can sustain for longer and longer periods of time, without distraction arising in the mind. And that is another way of talking about progressing in meditation as a skill. So there is, as we have a long-term meditation practice, necessarily we are going to make progress in cultivating calm, focused attention. And there's a relaxation response that necessarily happens in the body, particularly as a person cultivates the deeper absorptions of meditation after years of having a practice. And so if we start out thinking about the physical body and the posture that we put the physical body in, and having it be a really stable posture, then when this relaxation response begins to kick in, the body will be taken care of. The body will be kind of set in this posture that is very stable, and the body is able to naturally kind of let go and relax into this posture. And this allows for the body to not be its own obstacle in cultivating these advanced, more advanced stages of meditative absorption. And so if we don't cultivate a good habit with the physical body from the beginning, we can get to a point where our body, because we haven't really developed a stable position, the body becomes an obstacle, kind of takes us out of kind of letting go and just absorbing into the object in these higher states. So you don't want to sort of learn bad habits from the beginning that might become an obstacle later on. So that's why they kind of stress understanding how to establish your body in a stable position. So the ideal position, which is quite challenging, and if a person can't do it right away, it's possible, given maybe their age, and with time, possible maybe in a few years they might be able to become more and more flexible. But the ideal position is called the full Vajra position, and it does require a high degree of flexibility. It's quite challenging for most people. So if you can do that, just to present the ideal, we just will assume that this person is using a cushion on the floor. And the most important aspect of the full Vajra position is what they're doing with their legs. So the full Vajra position assumes that each foot is resting on each opposing thigh, which is very, as I said, very difficult to pull some people naturally just very flexible, and maybe you can do it no problem. A lot of adults, it's a real challenge to be able to pull that foot all the way up onto the opposing thigh. So, both of them are, resting on the opposing thigh. Really challenging. If you can't do that, then you would do the half Vajra, which is tucking one foot underneath, and then having the other foot on the other thigh. So one underneath the leg, the other foot on the other thigh. That's the half Vajra, or sometimes called full lotus and half lotus, or full Vajra and half Vajra. That's also pretty challenging. What most people do, to be honest, is they just sit in a natural cross-legged position. There isn't really any specific technique that's taught within Tibetan Buddhism for in terms of systems of movement, systems of flexibility. Because I mean, there are things like yoga, Tai Chi, Qigong, but none of those are Tibetan in origin. But they're all wonderful movement systems that help you to create better, mind-body connection, increase flexibility, and so on. But there's nothing specifically within Tibetan culture that's similar. Um, Basically, what they would say is if you can only do normal cross-legged position, great, you start there. And then at the beginning of every session, you take one foot and you kind of try to pull it in the direction of the opposing thigh until it starts to be just slightly uncomfortable. Certainly don't do anything that causes any pain, but until you start to feel a stretch, and then try to leave it there for a few seconds at least before going back to normal cross-legged position. If you do that every single day, then in a few years, maybe you'll be able to get into full Vajra position. Um, and if you just decide not to worry about it, that's perfectly valid too. If you're just like, cross-legged position, or again, if you're just like, I'm going to use a chair because that's what's reasonable for me, then that's totally fine. Don't worry about it. Um, but those are the three things that we would do with our legs, either normal cross-legged, half Vajra, full Vajra. But again, use a chair if you need to. If you are going to use a chair, then you would want a straight back chair that and you would probably want to put something underneath your feet so that your feet are supported. Um, so those are the different options with your legs. Moving upward from the legs, really the most important, because again, we've got all of these different options with what we're going to do with our legs, and they're all valid. Really, the most important part of the posture is our back, our spine, having an upright spine. That's really the most important part of the posture. We want to, from the very beginning, we want to make sure that we have an awareness of slouching or leaning. And we want to try to correct any instances of slouching, of leaning. It can support a drowsy, it can support going off into sleepiness when we relax our posture too much. And so we really want to, when we know, and of course, we're going to notice, because if you try to meditate after a couple of days, you're going to have sort of aches and pains and a lot of small stabilizing muscles in your low back and so on. So it's going to take some time to build up the habit of holding yourself upright in a stable position. But you do want to maintain an awareness of, have I started to lean? Have I started to slouch over? And then bring, a correction to that. Make sure that you have an upright spine. You don't want to have a real tight, contracted, whole back either, but you do want to make sure that you don't have a rounded spine, and that you're not leaning back. And that's why I say a straight back chair rather than like an armchair or something. And you probably would want to sit a little bit forward in that chair so that you're not relying on the backrest. You want it to be a kind of a utilitarian chair, and you want to sit a little bit forward so that you're required to hold yourself up under your own power, because you do want to develop those, again, those small stabilizing muscles that are going to help you maintain a stable position. Okay. So then with our arms and our hands, generally what we would do is we would take the right hand and put it over the left hand, and then just touch the thumbs, and then just place that right up against the body. So not outward toward the knees, just resting right up against a soft belly. That's what you want to do. If you feel more comfortable, resting your hands on your knees, totally fine too. Um, this kind of posture is a little bit more common, but if you do feel more comfortable, you can just take your palms down and rest them on your knees. What you do want to avoid is, resting, just having your arms dangling at your side, whether it's a chair or a cushion. That's not a good. The blood's going to pool in your hands. Your hands are going to fall asleep. It's not a good idea. But either of those two options is fine. Whatever you do feel more comfortable with is fine. So then, we're focusing on having an upright spine. We've got our hands in our lap with right over left, and then the thumbs just gently, not pushing into each other, but just touching, and then just resting that up against the belly. So then we want to think about the neck, the head, the eyes, and we want to kind of have a very gentle downward gaze. So we're not looking up, we're not looking down. We're just at a very slight downward gaze. Our eyes, typically, what's most recommended is for us to maintain a little bit of light coming in at the bottom. So if you do feel more comfortable completely closing your eyes, that's okay. You can do that. If you go that route, then you do want to think about how much light, ambient light, is in the room at the time that you're meditating. What I wouldn't recommend is that a person go into a completely dark room and then totally shut their eyes. That's going to really help you tend toward drowsiness. So you do want more light coming in if your eyes are closed. But in an ideal world, you want to have the eyes about 3/4 of the way closed. And then your gaze is just unfocused, kind of in front of you, at a slight downward angle. But again, people have to experiment in your own daily life and see what works, what doesn't work. But you just want to play around with, because this idea of calm, focused attention, the body is, as I said, we're putting the body in this stable position and trying to just forget about it, trying to just let it do its own thing. The mind, although, needs to be very sharp, very focused, very attentive. And drowsiness, we'll talk about, as I mentioned, we'll talk about the obstacles to meditation, and drowsiness is certainly one of those obstacles. And it's something that we begin to set ourselves up for success with when we think about making sure that there really is enough light in the room, and that we're not just using this as a cat nap or as a way to sort of drift off into something that just seems peaceful. Because as I said, this really is a inner technology for cultivating constructive states of mind at a base level. That's what we're meant to be doing, and the restorative effects are really just, as I said, they're really just side effects, and not really the goal. Certainly we might develop an interest based on the fact that we're really stressed out and we're really anxious, and we think that it's not, and we will see improvement in those things if we stick with it over time. It's certainly not a cure for things that can be really wrong. But in terms of ordinary levels of stress and so on, it is helpful to create spaciousness in the mind. It doesn't prevent or treat disease or any kind of illness, but it can help a person certainly have more spaciousness, more resilience, and so on. But the goal, as I said, really is in 10 years, have I learned to be more patient? Have I learned to be more kind, and so on? That's the purpose of a meditation practice, is to have this long-term view and to see it as an inner technology for cultivating constructive states of mind. Um, so yeah, so that's what we would do then with um, our head, with our eyes, with our gaze. And then typically they also say, I've never found this to be particularly useful, but they say to rest your tongue on your upper palate. I guess maybe that just depends on how large your mouth is, how large your tongue is. For me, it kind of, that's just what things do naturally. But I guess if you want to think about resting your tongue on your upper palate, they say that reduces the impulse to swallow as you're meditating. It reduces the number of times that you have to swallow in the course of, which again is about forgetting what's happening in the body, kind of just not letting the body take you out of your calm, focused attention. That is something that is mentioned. So this idea of a cushion on the floor, that's also something in terms of, there's different options that are available to people, and does require some experimentation to see what's comfortable for you. Um, Sometimes people will, there's crescent shaped cushions, there are square cushions, there are round cushions, they're filled with different materials, they're of different heights. Sometimes people will use a larger cushion and then a smaller cushion. The larger cushion is really meant to protect your ankles. So if you've got hardwood floors, or then you probably do want a larger cushion, because you don't want your ankles resting on the hardwood. Um, so they would basically, just your ankles would be on this larger cushion, and then the smaller cushion would be on top of that, and that's what you'd be sitting on. The idea is that you want to be elevated. You want to have a slightly downward angle to the knees and to the thighs. That will relieve pressure. If you're just flat, if you're just seated directly on the ground and everything is at one level, then that's going to put a lot of strain on your knees, and that's going to be uncomfortable. So being elevated and having this slightly downward slope to the thighs and knees is really going to relieve that stress on your knees. And that's so typically they would call that a zafu and a zabuton. Those are the Zen words that have generally been adopted to refer to these kinds of cushions. But there's all kinds of options that are out there. You just kind of have to experiment with different heights. Some of them are memory foam, some of them are buckwheat hulls. They call it kapok or buckwheat hulls. Um, Lots of different options for what you would prefer to do that. So that is an overview of how to set your physical body in a session of formal meditation. Did that spark any questions or thoughts? Okay, so we'll move on then, and we'll begin to talk about two main skills that we use we possess presently to some degree already, and we utilize in meditation. And these are called concentration and introspective awareness. Uh, so, concentration, and these are two interrelated, um, somewhat different but interrelated skills that we depend upon in every session of meditation. So, with concentration, it is the skill or the ability to determine what our object is, which is again, I've used this idea of object several times now. And that's again getting at what could be a misconception for some people about meditation. Some people have the view, there's a sort of a popular view in society that meditation is just an emptying of the mind. And that's from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective, that is a misunderstanding of meditation. There's always something that we are in any given session of meditation, there's always an object that the meditator chooses beforehand. As I said, like loving kindness, like compassion, like generosity, like patience, where the person is going to intentionally focus on that object of meditation. So, concentration is the ability to hold the mind on that object, to generate that object in the mind, and then stick our awareness directly onto that object in a fixed way. And then, we can all do that, of course, for brief periods of time, right? If you try to think about someone, if you try to bring, the image of someone that you know to mind, you can do that, and their image will appear in your mind, perhaps quite vividly, quite strongly. But then, if you say, okay, I'm going to think about my my best friend, family member, and imagine that they're in front of me, you'll succeed. They will appear to the mind's eye. And then in 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, something else will arise. And, that image will be gone. That image will no longer be, really present in the mind. So the fact that we can generate that image and hold the mind to it for a period of time means that we have a certain degree of concentration, a certain degree of naturally being able to stick our awareness to the object. But then the mind is going to wander into a different object. Um, and when that happens, we use a different skill, the skill of introspective awareness, to notice that the mind has moved into something other than the intended object. So, if the intended object is patience, then there might be a variety of contemplations that are connected to generating patience. But if you start thinking about what you'd like to have for dinner, that has nothing to do with your intended object, but it's going to happen. And if any of us have tried to meditate, we know that things other than the intended object, even if the intended object is simply our breath, we know that other things will intrude on that goal of sticking the mind to the intended object. And that's when, from this perspective, from this meditative perspective, we need to employ introspective awareness to become aware that there was an intended object, and now something other than the intended object is present in the mind, so that we can redirect our focus back to the intended object, and then do our best to use now concentration to stick our awareness to the intended object up until the next distraction arises, right? That's the job. That's the way that it goes. That's what we're doing. We're choosing an intended object. We're generating it, and then we're dealing with distraction. We're dealing with all kinds of other thoughts and feelings and memories, because the mind isn't particularly used to this job of holding to one intended object. That's not typically what's going on in our day. Typically, we've got lots of different things that we're doing and thinking and responding to and engaging in the world with. And so the mind has learned over all of the decades that we've been alive to multitask and to go out to all of these different objects and interact with them. And we're trying to get the mind now to do something different. And it's going to take time and energy and repetition in order to train the mind in calm, focused attention that is able to stick to this intended object. And there is, unfortunately, there's no other method for that other than getting distracted, noticing that we've gotten distracted, and then generating the object again in our awareness, and then doing our best to stick our awareness onto that object. Over time, the mind will kind of figure out what we're trying to do, and it will get better at doing it just kind of on its own. It's sort of, like going to the gym and lifting the weights, over and over and over again. The muscle is going to figure out that it needs to, grow in response to this training. You don't have to make the muscle do that. And there's also nothing else you can do, right? If you want the muscle to grow, you have to give it this stimulus, and you have to do it over and over and over again, and you can't really stop. Just like, meditation is something that we have to do consistently over a long period of time. But then naturally the mind, when we respond to distraction in this way, which is important that we do, because of course, if we simply, up until now in our lives, as I said, maybe we are trying to engage in a task, but when a distraction arises, we probably to some degree have the habit of indulging in that distraction, right? The phone, you're working, on something, but then the phone rings, and you answer the phone, right? Or your stomach rumbles, and so you get up and you go get something to eat, or you feel some thirst, you go get something to drink. We are accustomed to allowing ourselves to indulge in other things that arise. If you're reading a book and the book reminds you of something, you might close the book and daydream for a few minutes about that, or all of these things that we do. And in meditation, that's really not the goal. The goal is to really do everything that we can to avoid intentionally. Of course, there's very little to nothing that we can do for quite a long time about the fact that mental events other than the intended object will naturally arise in the mind. But then the question is, what is under our control is how we deal with that distraction. If it's not the intended object, it is a distraction. So we do need to notice as quickly as possible that this distraction has arisen. And then we need to set aside that distraction, just let it go, and then simply return our awareness, lift our awareness up from attending to this distracting thought or feeling or memory, and then just simply bring it back to the object that we've intended for that particular session of meditation. And we have to do that like lifting weights. We have to do that every single time that distraction arises in the mind. So really good to cultivate an understanding that that's the process, right? There is no shortcut. There is no other process. There's nothing else that you can do that will lead to calm, focused attention, that will lead to this kind of inner transformation that you're using the inner technology of meditation to accomplish, other than getting distracted, noticing the distraction, and generating the object, the intended object, again and again and again. And what meditators find is that over longer time scales, that the distractions arise less frequently. They appear in the mind for shorter periods, um, and they are less intense. They're less, they grip the mind, you know, more lightly over time. So the duration, the intensity, and the frequency of distractions naturally shifts over longer periods of time. Doesn't happen right away, doesn't happen within days or weeks or months, but it does happen, if we stick with it over these longer periods of time. More and more of that session of meditation will be calm, focused attention on the intended object, which means that we have longer periods where we're absorbed in these virtuous objects, which means that our familiarity with these virtuous objects becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. And what Buddhism would say, as I mentioned before, everything now, everything presently that we find easy, that we find difficult, all of our natural responses, our instinctual, habitual responses, our thoughts, they're all just familiarities. They're all just that with which we're presently deeply familiar. So if a person has a short temper, they're simply presently deeply familiar with being short tempered. They are not different than a person who is very patient. That person is just presently familiar in a deep way with patience. And the short tempered person can become the patient person over, reasonably longer periods of time with this, by putting effort into it. Yeah. So these are the two complementary skills that we depend upon in meditation. We make an effort to hold the mind to the object, and then using concentration, the skill of concentration. And then when the mind, as it does, goes to something that we don't want, we bring the mind back again and again using introspective awareness. So introspective awareness is the analogies that they kind of use is kind of like a laser pointer versus a spotlight. So the laser pointer is the concentration that's focused on the intended object, but then simultaneously, you're kind of using a corner of your mind to pay attention to basically, am I or am I not concentrated on the intended object? Is that happening or not happening in this moment? That's introspective awareness. And then as soon as introspective awareness kind of sounds the alarm that something else is going on, then you now know, okay, I'm not going to indulge intentionally. Of course, when we start out meditating, we don't notice the arising of distraction for minutes, right? We recognize, oh, for the last 5 minutes, I've been thinking about this other thing, and like, oh, okay, I was really supposed to be doing this. So now, and that's perfectly fine. Even if it's not until it's been 5 minutes that you noticed that you were making up this whole story, this elaborate, chain of thoughts that are not related to the intended object, great, fine. You, at that moment, you've noticed, and at that moment, you bring the mind back. And then, the next time it'll be 4 minutes and 55 seconds that it took you to notice. And the idea is that we can notice right when we're still on the object and the mind is just starting to kind of bubble up in a different direction. The mind is just kind of trying, there's all of these different levels of concentration. And as soon as the object becomes a little bit indistinct, a little bit fuzzy, there's a little bit of a lapse of the immediacy, the vibrancy. Even at that point, even at that moment, you can say, okay, I need to generate this object more intensely in my experience. I need to not allow the mind to wander. And that, of course, that's a description of what's happening now versus what could be happening in 2 or 3 or 5 years after, we've had this really consistent practice. Okay, any thoughts or questions?
No, not by the moment. I think everything was clear. Um, I think for many of us happen that sometimes our mind just goes away, and it's for beginners it's quite difficult to come back and just get back to the moment. So I think this it's a lot of practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. We may for a long time, if we have 10 or 15-minute sessions, for probably, the first 6 months, we might, in each of those sessions, the mind might only be on the intended object for 2 or 3 minutes, of the 10 minutes, the 15 minutes, and the rest of the time really might be distraction. So it isn't, the question is really just, am I doing my best to notice whenever distraction arises? Again, we're not judging because that's what the mind does, right? The mind generates objects to be observing. The mind moves toward objects to be engaged with. And so we can't fight what the natural tendency of the mind is. We don't judge the fact that that's what the mind naturally wants to do. All we can do is go into each session with an understanding that I'm going to do my very best to notice when distraction arises and then to generate the object again. And if we give into feelings of judgment, feelings of frustration, then that's going to make the sessions really unpleasant. And then we'll probably give up after a relatively, because what they say is that everyone who starts to meditate goes through a process where they feel like that their mind is just a disaster, and that they are particularly awful at this, and and really all that's happening is that when we haven't made an effort to quiet the mind, to calm the mind, to concentrate the mind, we've never paid attention to how naturally discursive the mind is. how easily and how often the mind wants to find things to occupy its attention, its awareness. Um, and you begin to become aware that that is the nature of your own mind, is this constant discursiveness. Um, so we just have to recognize that that is the nature of my mind. And I'm going to just work with that in a very patient, really, we need to cultivate a sense of inquisitiveness, a sense of, not to some degree playfulness, in terms of feeling light about our practice, not feeling, heavy and that it's a chore, um, and just really investigating, the nature of our mind, and not having expectation, I think, is important. Not thinking, well, it's been a week, it's been a month, it's been a year, and I haven't noticed much change, and or I'm still struggling with this or that. We need to just go into every single individual session with the mindset that the goal is to cultivate a constructive state of mind, and then to deal with the arising of distraction in a very kind of inquisitive, um, like, oh, like I didn't realize that my mind had, all of this busyness, and but not in a judgmental, like, oh, it shouldn't be going like this, or this is going, that went well, this isn't going well, I need it to go, and I need it to be like this, not judging, in that sense. Because once we start to relate to the sessions of meditation negatively, then that's going to really make it difficult to have a consistent practice. All right, so we'll practice two types. We're going to practice, as I mentioned, it's not really a class. For the group practice of meditation, we do have a 30-minute meditation Monday through Friday at 7:30 a.m. Mountain Time, 7:30 to 8 a.m. Mountain Time. Everyone's welcome to that. But we are going to do two short meditations now to get you a little bit familiar with these two different states of mind that we're talking, or these two different skills: concentration and awareness, and introspective awareness. Okay, so if of course, you're probably in a chair, totally fine. Don't worry about it. Just think about what we've said about stable, upright posture. So, mainly thinking about an upright spine, mainly thinking about not slouching, not leaning, and putting your arms and your hands up against a soft belly, because also having that, pressure against your thighs is going to help to keep you upright. Having that kind of resistance. So just do whatever works for you to sit comfortably. And begin to focus on your breathing. I think whatever's happening in your environment, you just let go. No need to pay any attention to anything in your visual field, any sounds. And just give yourself the instruction to concentrate your awareness on the physical sensation that accompanies the in breath and the out breath in the space around the opening of the nostrils. So don't try to control your breathing. Breathing naturally, breathing normally. And any sensations that you observe on the in breath and the out breath, you just try to hold your mind to the flow of those sensations. Breathing will naturally slow, and the sensations might become more subtle. And there's no wrong way to attend to the breath. Just try to keep your awareness on the sensations that are generated by your in breath and your out breath in the space around the opening of the nostrils. We'll do that silently for a couple of minutes. And now begin to slightly relax your strict focus on the physical sensation of the breath, and while using that as an anchor, just become aware of whatever arises in your mind. You may become aware of sensations, sounds, images. Just note the arising of these objects, trying not to elaborate and create stories around them. Just note their arising. And each time return back to the breath while being receptive, being aware of the next thought or feeling. And then when you're ready, we'll come back together. All right, so with that exercise, in the beginning, we were, just focused on the sensation of the breath. And when we were doing that aspect of it, we were emphasizing the skill of concentration. Then, when we relaxed the focus a bit and we began to note what was arising without following it, without elaborating on it, but we had a more global focus. That practice is called bare awareness practice, and that was emphasizing the skill of introspective awareness, having clarity around what is happening in the mind as it's happening, being able to recognize, so this is happening, now this is happening, without controlling it, in the same way, without using the breath as an anchor, but not being totally tied just to the breath itself. So that's a kind of a way of getting a flavor of these two complementary skills or processes that are occurring in the mind. Of course, when we were doing the concentration part, of course, you can't do that if there's no introspective awareness. So we're just talking about which one is more being emphasized. They're both, required at all times. But it's a way of kind of seeing or feeling how they are distinct, how they are complementary. All right, we've got a few more minutes left in the class. Are there did anything that has been covered generate a thought or a question, a concern, a disagreement? All are welcome.
I have one question related, for example, um, the practice of meditation of a person that is sick or it's lying on the bed because it's not able to be sit. Um, in in that position, is just putting your hands in the way that you show us, and obviously watching to the ceiling, or how would you recommend doing a meditation for these kind of people that are have disabilities and are almost all the day lying on the bed?
Yeah, I mean, the Buddha did teach, that as a valid option. It can be tricky in the sense that we often associate lying down with going to sleep, and so that can be tricky. If it's possible to have some other location other than literally the bed in which a person sleeps, that might be helpful. Even if it's just like a couch or some other place other than literally the place where the sleeping happens, then that can help to interrupt that association between the two. But yeah, I mean, if people have to do whatever works for them, and so however a person needs to get into a comfortable position with pillows, with support, just do whatever you have to do. And if you have your arms, the thing, if you're seated, you don't want to have your arms dangling, because it's the lack of support that's going to cause the blood to pool, and then your hands are going to tingle and fall. But if you're laying on your back and your arms are just out, just lying by your side, that's totally fine. Or maybe, they're resting on your chest, or, whatever feels more comfortable for you, you know, just do whatever you have to do to, to get yourself into a supportive physical posture is totally fine. Again, I think, if it's possible to find one separate location where you're going to move to when the meditation is happening, that might be the best way to kind of separate so that it doesn't seem as similar as falling asleep. But
Okay. Thank you.
any other thoughts or questions? I think I've covered what I wanted to cover for today. So if there are any questions, we can address them. Otherwise, we can meet back again next week. Venerable Yuntin is here in Santa Fe, if anyone is local. Otherwise, she'll be teaching online as well. She starts on Thursday. She's doing a retreat January 2nd and 3rd, also in person and online. It's on establishing and deepening your meditation practice. So, that's certainly going to be a wonderful thing that's happening shortly. And she's teaching a number of other classes and workshops as well. They're all online and in person. All right, sounds like we are all done. Have a great night and hope to see you next week.